I think it's a kind of a good ending point. It segues very well into kind of the first kind of bigger discussion question. It is again the question that's kind of perpetually on everyone's minds right now. The implications of or the impacts that COVID-19 will have on these markets. And what I found very interesting is the relationship of that to some of the maps that Peter was showing, where there's this kind of idea of incredible density in Toronto, and of course there are many factors to that. But it's this idea of kind of centralized place, both for living and for working. So I guess the question for both of you is, as a result of COVID-19, we're suddenly very aware of our proximity to people, and of course being in offices and housing. Do you think that will impact the kind of geography of development, that we'll see decentralization of building, both in housing and in places of work?
I'll let Peter field that first.
No, I don't think it will. I think that in times of crisis, people, particularly the media, speculate on what could be potentially profound changes. It's sort of our human nature. But we're also, by nature, extremely optimistic. And what happens is when the crisis is passed, we often go back to our position, our starting position. I think the question to ask those that advocate or suggest or prophesize that it's the end of cities is why are people living in cities in the first place? And part of what I was sort of trying to talk about in my rapid fire presentation is I had a client a number of years ago, a fellow former city planner, a guy named Howard Cohen, who was also an architect originally. And when we started working with him in the late 90s, coming out of a terrible recession that Ontario was in, he said he wanted to go after, in terms of the market, as a condominium market that he wanted to target, were the walk to work people. And I kind of giggled and I said, walk to work? Who walks to work? The reality is a lot of people walk to work. And what we're seeing is in downtown Toronto in particular is a compact village of high density commercial development, stuff as John's doing, and high density residential stuff, that kind of stuff that our office does. And I mean, I live downtown Toronto, I live a block from my office. One thing that I absolutely hate is wasting time commuting. And I have a house up north that I go to on weekends, and it can take me 45 minutes to get from my office to the Gardiner Expressway, and then maybe another 45 minutes to get to my house. So there's an enormous amount of time that's simply wasted in commuting. And that's principally why we are almost going back, I think, to kind of medieval way of living, which is everything is a very compact, albeit much denser, but a compact core in which everyone is very tightly arranged. And I just don't see, like the idea of suburban development that we experienced at the end of the Second World War was the belief of more green space, more land at a lower cost. That was all great, but you cannot expand a city indefinitely. And I also don't believe, having tried to run an office for the last 3 months, that you can do it through Zoom and other conferencing. You can't have a proper collaborative and collegial environment, a work environment this way. And so I don't think it's our nature to do it. I think it's a good stopgap method, but I don't think it's going to significantly change work patterns. But anyway, that's just what we should check in a year or two from now and see if I'm right or I'm wrong.
Yep. I could expand a little bit on that as well. I think I agree with Peter's comment about, going back to think about why are people living in cities. I think that's a critical point to start from. And then to say, okay, how have any of those parameters changed? And, and then use that to guide your thought process. I mean, I don't think things are going to go back to being exactly the way they were before. There's certainly going to be a at least in the midterm, a certain rethink of how office space works and how much space people have to themselves in a building and how we use the space. But I do think the fundamental drivers of people getting together in cities for commerce and for social reasons are overwhelming and will continue to be drivers of how people live and how they make their economic decisions. I also think that cities offer, in times of crisis, they can also offer a very deep well of support systems. And you can just look at the medical facilities and all the ease with which we can provide people with contactless delivery and all that sort of logistical work. It's in many ways much easier in a city than in a very spread out, sprawling suburban environment. So there definitely will be some adjustments, but I think fundamentally density is reasonable density is still a very compelling and desirable thing, both from a economic point of view and from a social point of view.
Thank you for that. Admittedly, the next question also kind of deals with this kind of scenario of great uncertainty that we're in, and I think both of you kind of addressed this in different ways. But one of the speakers this morning said that the whole discussion centers around different kind of currencies and value systems. But he said that the currency of architecture is opportunity. And of course, at times of great disruption, do provide times of great opportunity as well. Would both of you, or either of you, be able to speak a bit more, especially as the audience is largely kind of young, aspiring professionals, with the kind of opportunity that, or opportunities that these crises can provide across kind of a whole range of scales of practice?
I could take a shot at that, just based on a little bit of my own experience when I was starting my career, or when I was shifting. Well, I guess both really. So looking back, I mean, I can't ascribe any too deep of a strategy to what evolved, other than it was part. I guess they say that what is it? Luck favors the well prepared. So I think. I came out of school at the end of a boom, and then there was a sort of a period of retrenchment. And so that created the opportunity for me to go back to business school and get an MBA. And so when I emerged from the MBA, the opportunities and I was still wanted to be focused on real estate, the opportunities were around some organizations that were very specialized in trying to work out distressed real estate, that was commercial real estate that was non-performing for whatever reason, and sort of people had sort of thrown the keys back to the bank and say, here, I don't want this, whatever it is, I can't pay the mortgage, here, take it. So it was real estate that had essentially been deemed to have little to no value. And so this organization I worked for, this company, we were kind of picking up the pieces. And what a great place for a young professional to start out, because you learn everything from, you're like opening the hood going, what the hell, what's wrong with this thing? Why didn't it make money? And so you're taking it apart and then figuring out what doesn't work and putting it back together. And you're seeing, the best and the worst, mostly the worst of decisions that were made in the past. And, but what an opportunity to learn from, a circumstance that was really something that was a fairly major economic impact at the time, but I was able to learn a lot about how real estate worked by going through that process of working through these distressed assets. So I was only there with that company for a couple of years, and then eventually moved on and worked with Brookfield Properties, where they had a sort of workout process of their own going on. And so, but that allowed me to, because I'd had that experience, it gave me a bit of currency there as well, because I was able to understand some of what they were dealing with as they tried to work through their own portfolio of assets that were, to some degree troubled. And things have gone very well for them since that time. But it's just I guess the takeaway from all of that is you kind of have to combine your own circumstance with the opportunities that are there, and you may have to find yourself doing something you didn't expect to be doing. I didn't expect to be working in, on a distressed loan portfolio. But it turned out to be a fantastic learning experience. So I think keeping an open mind and being as flexible as possible will stand you in good stead.
That's an interesting story, actually. I was thinking, when I graduated, I went to work for Arthur Erickson, who at the time was, a pretty world-acclaimed architect. Although I think I was there at the kind of the denouement of his career a little bit. But I worked there for about 7 or 8 years and worked on extraordinary projects around the world. They were all cultural and institutional projects. And we participated in many international design competitions. And I learned a lot about how to win competitions. And I imagined that that's the kind of practice that I would like to have. But parallel to that, I was desperate to start my own office. And I was always frustrated to have Arthur come in and simply change everything we've been working on. And so what I chose to do in terms of opportunities, currency, so I thought, so who's going to hire me? And most of our work had been overseas. I mean, it wasn't in Canada. At that point, he was practicing around the world. And so I thought, real estate developers, they're essentially optimistic people who are, by and large, prepared to give people a chance, as opposed to, let's say, the institutional sector, which is if anyone's ever been involved in a pitch to, for example, the University of Toronto, they have such and such a building. You have to show in the last 5 years how many buildings you've built just like that. And so it becomes a bit of a catch-22 to get into that kind of sector of work. You've had to have been in it. And so how do you get going? So I found myself in a career where I didn't start out that way, but I thought, well, maybe real estate development will allow me to kind of launch my career and start to build a practice. But also careful what you wish for, because real estate development is very, very cyclical, particularly merchant builders. And you can have boom years and you can have very, very fallow years. And so that you really need, to the extent you can, to develop a diversified, very broad practice in terms of different product or project categories and different building types and different client base.
Yeah, I think that point of maybe correct me if I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that idea of kind of aligning yourself or finding people who are willing to take risks, especially market risks, is a really interesting point, which kind of leads into the next. It's kind of a panel discussion. I think Peter, maybe it's directed more towards you. But the question of risk comes up time and time again in discussions of investment and of development, and a lot of those discussions surround the developers and the financiers of these projects, but especially in residential development and especially in condominium models. I'm wondering how much questions of kind of risk and of long-term accumulation, like people buy condominiums privately, at least for their kind of long-term benefit. I'm wondering how much that kind of feeds into, or how much impact that has on development as a whole. So risk acquired, not so much as kind of developers and as financiers, but as kind of the private individual homeowner or condo owner.
I'm not sure I can completely answer your question, but I'll try. The The interesting thing about condominium development, and I'm also a developer, so I also develop condominiums, is that it's a peculiarity of the financing in Canada, particularly, where you have to pre-sell a certain percentage of units, and that percentage is largely determined on a value basis, which is to say, a bank will say, look, if you can generate revenue equal to the amount of money you want to borrow from us, then we'll loan it to you. So that typically is upwards of 65 to 75% of the project has to be pre-sold. So what you end up with is, as a practitioner, as an architect, designing buildings that are pre-sold and haven't been properly, well, they haven't been executed at all, whether properly or otherwise. And so that has a tremendous impact on your work and the final result of the building, such as this horrible term, value engineering. So one of the things about merchant builders and why I like to work with institutional developers, actually, well, I like both, but institutional developers will look at a long-term value proposition. So they'll be developing a building and they'll say, look, we're going to hold this building for 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, whatever the time frame is. We think it's important to invest in this building in terms of life cycle costing. So it's a bit like you're building your house. You say, I'm going to be here for 30 years. I'm going to put in the best windows I can. Or I'm building, this is my first house. I'm going to sell it in 3 years. So I'm going to use the cheapest windows I can. So merchant builders are all about how now that I've sold a product, a commodity to someone, how can I deliver it at the low and squeeze cost out of projects. What I've learned as a practitioner is to try to design buildings for merchant builders that are almost impossible to value engineer. So that I try and think like my clients, and I try and use buildings and systems and details that you can't value engineer. In other words, you don't try to do something extraordinary architecturally that you know the final result will get value engineered and it will be a horrible, horrible result. It's better to start with understanding the basis of the kind of finance structure of the project, and then work with that and try and do a really good project. So it's actually harder in many ways to practice architecture that way. Whereas with institutional builders, so we're working with Ontario Pension Board, another large pension fund in Ontario, on a project out in Pickering. And this is a fascinating project because it's going to include a performing arts center, like it has major cultural aspects to it. So performing arts center, a public library, it also has rental housing. All of this is non-merchant building stuff. And so there are great debates and conversations and discussions about the quality of buildings and materials and details. And there's a kind of a value analysis of that you don't get into with merchant builders. So if in the US, the work that we've done, residential work, we just finished recently a large project in New York. There it tends to be, what's really interesting there is that pre-sale is considered like a stock market offering. And so it comes under securities legislation. And so it is much more strict than what it is in Ontario or indeed the rest of Canada. And so what most developers there do is they build and then sell. And so you get a situation in which, not unlike institutional builders, where they're speculating on whether they can sell a unit, and people are not going to buy it unless they can see it. And so the attention to detail and the quality of materials is much more important than it is in Toronto. So it's important when you're operating in whatever, as a practitioner, in whatever market you're operating in, whoever your client is, to really understand your client, understand what their financial and their development objectives are, to really understand it, rather than engage in a debate and an argument about, why you're going to value engineer this. Try and embrace it and then say, So that is one of the criteria that I need to consider as an architect, criterion that I need to consider as an architect and embrace it and try and embed it into the architecture. That's the challenge. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a great point, Peter. As someone, you know, I've been, I guess, a client as well as an architect, and I think that last point you made about trying to understand the client as an architect, try to understand the client's position and the drivers behind the client's business is one of the most valuable things you can do if you want to make yourself valuable to the client, because then you, instead of the client arguing with you about something, they feel that they have a partner at the table in trying to accomplish their objective. And that's super valuable. And you, by doing that, by taking on that role, you'll make yourself a valued member of their team, and that will, you know, serve you well in the long run. So that's a great point.
That was actually a really fascinating, or both very fascinating responses. And there's actually a lot to unpack in them. Unfortunately, because of time, I think we're going to now move to the kind of to open up the floor for questions from everyone who's listening in. There are already 4 questions, or 5 or 6. But I'll remind everyone that if you do have a question, please post it to everyone in the kind of chat. So I'll read through the first question, which is for John. It's from Elise. How does affordable housing play out in commercial real estate? If the main goal is to produce financial income and appeal to investors to meet demand, how does the demand for affordable housing get addressed despite not providing as high returns for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a fantastic question. This is an example where, I mean, I think this is a realm where governments need to be a little bit less timid on this front, and they need to be just very consistent, because the role for government in a properly functioning economy is to, you know, set the rules that are in accordance with the society's goals, and then back off and let the private sector work within those rules. So I think with affordable housing, you know, the government, and ideally it's provincially and not necessarily at a municipal level, because municipalities compete with each other, and that's when you get into weird distortions in the marketplace when, like, say, Toronto adopts a certain affordable housing set of policies, but Mississauga doesn't. So then there's a disparity between those markets, and it will skew where investment takes place. It's better if you can take the widest possible view. So if possible, you know, provincially, and if the province were just to establish a clear, concise and understandable affordable housing benchmark requirement, then you know, I think that most developers are, you know, generally community-minded people that want to, you know, they want to kind of do the right thing and still make a profit. And by having that policy across the board, it levels the playing field. Everyone is playing by the same rules. Everyone can then just sharpen their pencils and try to do the best within those rules. I think that's the easiest way of doing it. And then you don't have that issue about, as the questioner suggested, how do you deal with the fact that you're not providing, you know, returns that are as high as your investors were expecting? You're still providing a competitive return. You're doing, you know, your project is on the same footing as the project across the street or in the next city. So it doesn't resolve all the problems, but it certainly eliminates any disparity of when you try to have a very localized policy applied either in one city, one part of a city, or just one sector of the development business. That's when you get, you know, big challenges come out of that don't really help anyone.
I just add to that. I actually think that from your perspective, John, your position, that's a very enlightened response. That typically developers resist this idea of the imposition of social housing. And I would argue, and sort of build on what you're saying, that I think in any civilized liberal democracy, housing is an essential right. You look at a jurisdiction like Hong Kong, almost 50% of the housing built in Hong Kong, and that's an ardent capitalist until maybe recently economy, is publicly developed, which is extraordinary. And I think the market is extraordinarily adaptable and resilient. And if you say to developers, you have to have some way of providing social housing, however, affordable housing, however that's measured and implemented, and that's a whole other big, long discussion about how it's done, the market will adjust and it will fold it in and it will do it. The great kind of shock absorber in development is land price. And so land price tends to escalate to fill that void. So if we have, and we've had in housing prices in Toronto over the last 5 years, extraordinarily high run up in housing prices. Land is just kind of, as projects sell for more than next month, there's another prospectus for a land parcel downtown Toronto. It's just gone up 20% because the market's gone up 20%. And so land can also deflate at the same time and absorb the cost of providing a portion of affordable housing. I'm a big believer in that. The question is, and I would agree, it should be at a provincial level, not a municipal level, because Toronto's not a city-state, although it thinks it is. It's so it'd be much more consistent, and well, I'll just leave it at that.
That question of kind of geographic differentiation, I guess, as well, is a really interesting consideration, how those kind of policies interact with each other. And that's a very interesting additional aspect to it. The next question is from Nathan. So both of you have mentioned the complex rezoning approval process necessary in Toronto. What are some keys to obtaining approval in the current system? And can either of you talk about the effects of the current system and why they haven't been changed or challenged?
That's a topic I love to talk about. I have a theory that it's a theory adopted by a former partner of Shop Architects in New York, who speculated that, or mused that, if you look at post-Second World War planning theory, that most of the planners that are in power now in North American municipalities really graduated and had their education in the 70s, which was a time of great social upheaval and had many, many sort of impacts on people's thinking, to the point where we have now a planning structure that is deeply suspicious of private sector development. And we also have, in the case of the city of Toronto, a city that doesn't want to grow up. And I call it the sort of Jane Jacobs syndrome, where Jane Jacobs, we all know her, she came out of the blockbusting and urban renewal, infrastructural urban renewal projects of New York City in the 50s and 60s. And so she had a whole theory about neighborhood protection, which was born out of that context and that experience. Applied in Toronto, it is kind of anachronistic, because the neighborhoods of Toronto, I show that figure ground map of what's zoned for intensity or intensification and what's not, those neighborhoods are largely protected. So most of the development is going to occur in those growth centers. And yet we have a planning department that believes two things. One is that they need to curtail growth somehow, that it's evil. And two, that they believe that they can control it in terms of use. So I had a conversation with Greg Lintern, who's recently the chief planning official in the city of Toronto. And we were proposing a development at Yonge and Gerrard. And we had a deal with the planning department, but Greg came in at the 11th hour and sort of kiboshed it. And he said, look, Peter, I just think that this is too dense. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, this is basically hyperdensity. And he said, where in the city can you show us this kind of hyperdensity? And I said, well, what about the South Core, which is, I would argue, is a pretty successful area of Toronto. That's the area kind of from Front Street south down to Lakeshore Boulevard, and includes, albeit very robust, but a very interesting collection of commercial and residential and recreational and retail development. And it is, in many ways, what's driving the economy of downtown Toronto. So I said, so Greg, I mean, during your tenure, you've seen that development. He said, well, it kind of lacks a granularity. And I said, no, it absolutely lacks a granularity, but you get granularity in the neighborhoods. So if you use the example of New York City, its economy is really driven by Midtown Manhattan, which is where all the density is, large density is occurred. Its granularity is in its protected neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, which is what Jane Jacobs was trying to protect. And so cities need to be many things. And what we need, and the hardest thing that we run up against, is a resistance on the part of the city and the councillors to embrace this idea of change and densification that is actually a good thing. And I'll just close on one last thing, which is, I think, a common misconception about density. And there was a recent article in The Guardian this past week written by an engineer from Arab, a senior engineer, who said that tall buildings should not be built because they're basically unsustainable in the amount of embedded energy that they have in them. So this gentleman compared a low-rise or mid-rise building to a tall building and said, see, it's better to do a mid-rise building. And it kind of misses the whole point. The greatest act of sustainability that I think that the Western world can do is embrace intensification. That you cannot look at a building in isolation. You have to understand its context. And so when you build and you intensify downtown, what you do is you obviate the need for sort of massive infrastructure projects such as transit and the decentralization of other services. And there's enormous embedded energy and ongoing energy in those systems. And so it's to convince the city that this is a good thing is, as a practitioner, that is the hardest thing I have to face.
Yeah, I think I totally I concur with you, Peter, on that front. There's a real discomfort with density, even in places where they have said, or in the city policies say they want density. It doesn't come easily for them, and there's an undercurrent of wanting to control everything down to a level of minutia that's very frustrating. Just to speak to a couple of the other subpoints in the question, keys to obtaining approval in the current system. I mean, I don't think any of us have discovered that yet, but that some of the best things to try is again trying to understand what the planners, the local planner, and the community are, what's important to them, and what are their goals for. If you just sort of is setting aside maybe different ideas about what they think is the appropriate amount of density, but what is it that they think is important about that site, and what do they want to accomplish? Figure that out, and then try to deliver that so that they have achieved the thing they wanted to achieve, together with maybe having to accept something that they're not that comfortable with, but at least they have come away with the whether it's a public space or a particular configuration in a portion of the site or some certain treatment. If you can figure out what's important to the community and the planner, and hopefully those things are similar, then that's one way to achieve to move things forward, because then they feel they're getting a positive as part of the process.
So that's actually a very good point, that Toronto, its municipal structure are ward councillors. So the city is divided in a series of wards. Each ward is run by a councillor who is the de facto almost planning commissioner of that ward. When you compare municipal structure, political structure of Toronto to, say, Vancouver has what are called councillors at large. So they elect a roster of 20 some odd councillors, and they represent the city, look at it hopefully holistically, and what benefits Vancouver as opposed to a particular neighborhood. So you're absolutely right, John. You need to sort of zero in on the counselor and what the counselor feels that the neighborhood wants. And we have a public meeting this evening in a large project at the University of Toronto. And it's very controversial. It's by the wrong. And it's largely being driven at kind of a grassroots level of resistance and the kind of citizenry concern that then is transmitted through the counselor. And we have to convince the counselor in order to get that project approved.
Again, for the answer of every one of these questions, there are kind of more questions that just proliferate out of these things, or out of these responses rather. But I think we should move on to the next question, which is from Vincent. So it is a question for John. When institutional developers only serve to provide value to, when institutional developers only serve to provide value to employees who have access to job with pensions. Sorry, I should have pre-read this.
It's okay. I can see it. I can see the chat on my screen. Yeah. No, really good question. I mean, it's, you know, the pension system, as I mentioned, it's unique in Canada, and it does work well for the people that have them. But, you know, what about everybody else? And ironically, employees of Oxford, because Oxford used to be a private company which was bought by the OMERS, we actually don't have OMERS pensions, which is kind of funny. We have to take care, you know, we have the same thing everyone else has. We have to get an RSP. So it's kind of funny. But it's a very good, you know, I don't have a good answer for you. I think it's a political it's a very political question that, you know, needs to be addressed at a broader level. I think that, you know, collectively the pension system can provide a high level of security, but you know, they're not cheap. You have to convince people to give up, because the pensions are contributed to both by the employer and also by the employee. So whatever your salary is, you could be giving, you know, 12, 13, 15, 20% of your salary every month goes into this pension, and it's run by these people downtown in a big office building. Like, how do you feel about that? So it doesn't come without its challenges. It's in terms of getting everyone to buy into it. A lot of folks like the idea of having control over their own investment decisions and deciding, you know, where they're going to invest their money. But you know, I don't have any answer beyond that, but I can say that from what I can see, you know, the collective larger scale pension organizations can provide good value, but it's certainly not for everyone. And you know, I suppose all I could suggest is, you know, maybe when you're looking for employment, you know, that becomes a question to ask, because I think it's a question that people don't ask very much. Especially when you're very young, you don't really think about it as much because it's so far in the future, but maybe it's something worth asking. And if enough people ask for it, it will become a recruitment, you know, it become a point of recruitment, and firms will start thinking more about it and how they can provide better accommodation for that. And so perhaps, you know, it'll cause a change over time. Anyone else want to chime in on that politically charged question?
I'm going to stay away from that one.
Yeah, well, ask for it when you're you know, seeking employment. See if you can, you know, it can be a point of negotiation, perhaps.
I think the next question is also for you, John. It's quite a lengthy question. I don't know if you want to read it again.
Yep, sorry, I just iterative development. Yeah. Okay. It's a very good question. Like, how can you, you know, architects having agency earlier and reduce the iterative quality of, or the iterative process? I think yes and no. I think I mean, one way that architects have more this has happened in a way, like in our organization, there's 2 or 3 people that have architectural backgrounds, working in our group. So so at an early stage, we don't necessarily have to hire architects, but we have people that are familiar with that form of thinking, and they can go through some of that thought process without necessarily having to engage an architect. But I mean, you've sort of answered your own question to a degree that yes, I think that, to the maximum extent possible, architects should seek to try to, provide input earlier in the project. And, one ways you can do that is to participate in, feasibility studies and early pro forma studies. I mean, often, unfortunately, and Peter maybe can speak to this, but I think often there's an expectation in the business world that because, say, a merchant developer, when they're looking at a site at those early stages, when this process is happening, they're not getting paid, and they may not have a real project, so they're very cost sensitive at this stage of work. And if you can figure out a way as a practitioner to insinuate yourself into that process, perhaps at a very economical way, or even at no cost, to do some preliminary studies, that can be a good way of getting yourself sort of involved in the process. And I mean, it's a slippery slope, so it's not without its risks. But I think Peter could provide some insight as well, as the questioner has mentioned. Peter, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, no, we certainly do a fair amount of let's say, free site analysis, particularly for merchant developers and sometimes for institutional developers, because of the speculative nature of a land pursuit and the cost sensitivity. And that is a good way to get work if you do a smart, intelligent response and a helpful response. And certainly early on in my practice, I did a lot of that kind of work. And that's what helped me build an office. I said earlier that I think to be a successful architect, let's say non-institutionally or culturally, you need to understand and think and embrace the objectives of a particular project. But there's a careful balance between architects that become facilitators versus architects that are trying to really contribute to our built environment. And I think that architects also have an obligation to, whatever projects they're working on, to do extraordinary, compelling architecture to the extent that they can. And so, like all professions, you have those architects that think that their role simply is to facilitate a client. And then you have, on the other extreme, architects that think a client's role is simply to facilitate an architect in their design objectives. And so it's really trying to find in that continuum a careful balance where you are trying to do compelling work, but you're also being pragmatic in embracing the objectives of your client. I think if you can find that spot, you can potentially do both really good work and have a very robust practice.
There's also a follow-up question from Elise, who's asking if the kind of the importance and centrality of affordable housing is something that developers are advocating for actively, or are people really just waiting for government action?
Yeah, will you go ahead, John?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I don't think we're very actively advocating for it, probably, unfortunately, but it's, I mean, really, I think it's something where there needs to be a broader action for that to happen. I think, I think it's unusual to expect an industry to want to, as altruistic as it may seem, and everyone wants to sort of take a broad view. I don't think you can expect an industry to invite that level of intervention in a business that is already got a pretty high level of intervention around planning approvals, et cetera. But I think that the enlightened developers will be more accepting of it if it's done if it's done correctly on a broad basis and applies to everybody and it's a level playing field. Then let's just like game on, let's keep going. But it's when it's piecemeal and it disadvantages some people and it's only in one area and then it just creates another complexity. So I think it has to be a level of it does have to come. It's one instance where it needs to be a top-down action, in my opinion.
I 100% agree with that. I think that too often the kind of public discourse is that private sector companies or pension funds or other institutional investors somehow should be determining and executing social policy. And I don't agree with that. I mean, I'll use a very simple example, building codes. So if, we could say through moral suasion that people should build safe buildings. So what kind of city would we be creating? You could imagine someone coming out and saying, I've got 5 exit stairs instead of 2 exit stairs, therefore my building is better. What we believe in, I think, in Western democracies is legislation for the common good within which markets operate. And I think that whereas developers don't embrace affordable housing, as we said earlier, they will adopt it if forced to. And I think that is the power of government agencies and bureaucracies can do. I'll give you a little example, simple example. In working for merchant builders in high-rise residential, Toronto has this proclivity to have the worst facade systems anywhere in the world. And we're so good at it now, we're exporting it to the US and building big window wall plants in the US. And I've said to the city of Toronto, the one area in which they can lead in terms of the quality of buildings is to look at facade design and say, you know what, this is what you have to do. If you want this rezoning achieved, we are going to expect the following things. And one of them is the quality of facade. And the market will adjust. If everyone realizes that they have to do a better quality facade on their building to get approval, and it's an equal playing field, as John said, then we will have a commensurate, immediate rise in the quality of buildings that we're building. And that's the role I think the government can play in these sorts of rules and regulations. I don't think we should be looking at the private sector. We should ask the private sector to execute those objectives. And I think that's a fundamentally different way of thinking that most Canadians have a hard time getting around in their head.
Okay, the next question is from Conrad. So I think it's for both of you. Can you speak to the differences between working with the City of Toronto's development process compared to that of other jurisdictions? Does the kind of complexity and nuance of Toronto's process result in better architecture, or do you find working in jurisdictions with kind of a less developed framework more liberating?
Do you want to take the lead on that, Peter? You've probably done more in those different jurisdictions.
Fundamental difference that I find between, let's say, the City of Toronto and then the boroughs or not boroughs, cities and towns and municipalities around Toronto, and it's a big, big generalization. But in Toronto, I find is that you show up with a development proposal, a zoning proposal, and usually there's a reaction of negativity, but they would just wish you weren't there, or they would just wish that it would be 50% smaller or less of this and more of that, or it's never a positive experience. And I know people of this planning department very, very well. I've worked with them for the last 30 years, know a lot of them. I think they're very smart people, but I think that there is a collective cultural malaise within the City of Toronto. And I was part of a conversation with the chief building official recently, who runs the building department. And I said, you know, your building department is run like somehow we're trying to get away with murder on everything, and that your inspectors are looking for loopholes in our drawings. And I said, we're licensed professionals. We cannot contravene the building code knowingly. We don't go through loopholes. You do that at your peril. I mean, you'll be litigated, you'll be out of business very quickly. And so why do we have this attitude? Whereas around Toronto, Pickering is a great example, where the mayor of Pickering is completely engaged in the project that we're working on. They want development. They like change. They love modern architecture. They want to build a place, build a city. And that is fundamentally the difference between those two jurisdictions. And it's really very reflective in the approval process. That's not to say it isn't easy in Mississauga or elsewhere, but the more mature a community becomes, the more difficult it becomes to secure approvals, I found.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, I mean, we've built and are in the process of building some things in Mississauga, and they are much more open to and you know, I think a bit more enthusiastic about development happening when they have less of it, I guess. So it's whereas the great metaphor that one of our architects used in Toronto was, it's like working with the planners and the building department. It's like working with a team of goalies, right? They know how to stop things, but they don't know how to advance anything, right? And it's a great phrase that you know, they're always catching stuff, but they don't seem to have any sort of ambition to actually get things over the goal line and move on to the next project. So that's a frustrating thing.
They're largely governed by this kind of inverse municipal structure we talked about earlier, where the ward councillor is the de facto planning commissioner. So often they take their cue from that politician, and that politician takes their cue from their constituency. So if you take a canvas, a bunch of people in your building or on your street, should we make a major change? Chances are most people would say no, because they're operating and deferring to their own self-interest. But the role of municipal politicians, and the role of municipalities generally, and provinces and countries, is to look at a larger picture. What is in the interest of a larger group of citizenry, rather than just a neighborhood. And so it goes back to an earlier comment I said. And so this is a particular issue in the city of Toronto. It is a city governed by neighborhoods. So its greatest strength in many ways is its greatest weakness. And I would suggest that it's a good segue into the next question about someone's asking about, why can't we implement what Barcelona has in other jurisdictions with very strict heightened zoning restrictions? So I would argue, absolutely, why can't we do that? It would be very dangerous to do that right now, because the city of Toronto would zone everything at about 10 stories, and that would be that. But it would at least get to, I think back to the zoning diagram I showed in my talk of Midtown Manhattan. So there's a fascinating history about the zoning bylaws and how they've iterated over the years in New York City. As it's a city that is sort of maybe 50 years behind us in terms of its growth and development. In other words, it really grew between the two world wars. And we can learn a lot about how that kind of zoning regime changed. But it starts with not questioning the idea of density, but questioning what are the public realm objectives. So in Barcelona, the public realm objective is, I would argue or suggest there are predictable street width to building height, like that kind of street section, and that it is repeated everywhere. And that kind of consistency, street consistency, in part is what defines Barcelona. Toronto is not a European city. Toronto is a free market, very kind of messy city. We have also this juxtaposition of protected neighborhoods with rapid intensification occurring alongside those protected neighborhoods. So Europe went through this process 100 years ago. If you look at central Paris with housing, I mean, most of central Paris was built from 1890 to about 1930. was Hausmann reconstructing medieval Paris. And at that time, there must have been great social angst about what was going on. We're destroying this fabric for that fabric. But they had a belief about how to create a city at that time. But I don't think that particular model is relevant now. It needs to be a much more freewheeling model, but starting with the basis of what kind of city is it that we want to create. Now, John said, and then I'll shut up, that it's great work for architects, all of the zoning work. And that's true, and others, planners, and particularly municipal lawyers. But as a practitioner, I hate it. I'd rather just get on to someone tells me what the rules are, and then I try and do a really exquisite building within those rules. I sort of yearn for that. And in other jurisdictions around the world we've practiced in, that's what we've found. And in many ways, it's both causes a stricture, but it's also very liberating.
Yeah, it's the mutability of the rules that is, you know, that sort of negotiation world of that happens a lot in Toronto. It's so challenging. I remember years ago doing a rezoning, and it was, you know, we were trying to get the maximum height that we could get under the you know, in the current circumstances, but you just found it became a numbers game, that you felt that you would be you know, underperforming if you didn't get the maximum density, because you're pretty sure that next year someone would go and use your project as a precedent and get a couple more floors, and someone else would get a couple more floors. And I mean, nobody, you know, it's a frustrating kind of competitive situation. Whereas if it was, again, that idea of a level playing field, if there was a much more strict control of height, for instance, it would be, you know, it would free up a lot of time and resources to do other things and solve other problems. So I mean, that would be great, but you know, that's not the world that we live in at the moment. It is this very freewheeling sort of negotiated one-off set of zoning parameters. So, you know, I guess that's what we will continue to work with for the time being.
That's great. Thank you very much for those answers as well. We are at 10 after 3, and John, you indicated that you have to leave at 15:15. So I just wanted to say thank you very much again to both of you for coming. That was incredibly informative and very kind of content-rich series of addresses, and also the conversation and questions.
Great. Okay. Thank
you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.